Muito bom dia a todas e a todos. Vamos dar início à 6ª Conferência Anual da redeSAÚDE, este ano dedicada às perspectivas multidisciplinares e saúde global na Universidade de Lisboa. Para dirigir as primeiras palavras de boas-vindas, tem a palavra a professora doutora Cecília Rodrigues, vice-reitora da Universidade de Lisboa para a Investigação e Inovação.
Ora então, muito bom dia a todos. Excelentíssima Senhora Coordenadora da redeSAÚDE, Mónica Oliveira. Excelentíssima Senhora Coordenadora do Grupo de Investigação e Desenvolvimento da redeSAÚDE e também Chair da 6ª Conferência Anual da redeSAÚDE, Margarida Amaral. Convidados, participantes, quer aqui neste magnífico salão nobre da Reitoria da Universidade de Lisboa, quer também à distância, sejam bem-vindos à Universidade de Lisboa. Eu começo por transmitir os cumprimentos do Sr. Reitor, o professor Luís Ferreira, que com muita pena não pode hoje estar aqui presente e que eu aqui com muito gosto represento. Bem-vindos também a esta 6ª Conferência da redeSAÚDE, Perspectivas Multidisciplinares e Saúde Global na Universidade de Lisboa. Este tema e o programa, julgo eu que refletem, diria, na perfeição a atividade desta rede temática da saúde na Universidade de Lisboa. Esta é uma plataforma onde docentes, investigadores, estudantes das mais diversas áreas de saúde encontram um fórum para interagirem, colaborarem enquanto comunidade para responder a desafios societais globais. A redeSAÚDE cria assim, eu diria mesmo, um conjunto de oportunidades, um conjunto de desafios para que estas redes colaborativas funcionem, proporcionando iniciativas de investigação e de formação que são únicas, de facto, seguindo a perspectiva de uma universidade que se quer verdadeiramente aberta. E sendo a ciência aberta por natureza, este conceito de abertura da universidade ao exterior encaixa na perfeição e permite a partilha de conhecimento entre a comunidade científica, a sociedade de um modo geral, as empresas em particular, criando também, de certo modo, um caminho para ampliar o conhecimento e o impacto social e económico da ciência. A abertura deste processo científico enquanto um todo, e eu falo para lá do acesso aberto, naturalmente, reforça também o conceito de responsabilidade social científica e é, por isso, geradora de múltiplas oportunidades de inovação, permitindo impulsionar o desenvolvimento de produtos, de serviços e, quiçá, eventualmente também de negócios e de novas empresas em função das exigências do meio que nos rodeia. Eu volto ao início desta minha brevíssima intervenção para elogiar, não podia deixar de o fazer, a evolução da redeSAÚDE nesta sua missão, evolução esta que eu acho que tem sido, achamos todos certamente, tem sido extraordinária. O seu dinamismo é impressionante, a sua capacidade de realização é confirmada por múltiplas iniciativas e, em particular, é confirmada também pela realização das conferências anuais, sempre com uma agenda temática muito atual e este ano não é exceção, indo desde a inovação e digitalização em saúde até à demografia, tão peculiar e talvez até em contraciclo em Portugal relativamente a outros países, tendo em vista uma sociedade sempre mais saudável, mais competitiva, mais inteligente, mais conectada e também mais social. Eu desejo, por isso, um excelente dia de trabalho nesta 6ª Conferência Anual da redeSAÚDE. Obrigada pelo privilégio da vossa presença e também pela vossa companhia. Obrigado a todos e um bom dia.
Tem a palavra agora a professora doutora Mónica Oliveira, coordenadora da redeSAÚDE da Universidade de Lisboa.
Muito bom dia, bem-vindos a todos à 6ª Conferência, é com prazer que aqui estou. Queria começar por cumprimentar e muito agradecer à senhora vice-reitora, a Cecília Rodrigues, todo o apoio que tem dado à rede. Isto é um projeto de muitas pessoas e sem o qual todo o apoio da reitoria e de toda uma estrutura não teríamos feito nada. Queria cumprimentar a professora Margarida Amaral, que na qualidade de representante aqui do grupo de chefes da Conferência tem sido também uma impulsionadora da investigação e da inovação aqui no âmbito da redeSAÚDE. Queria cumprimentar a assistência, agradecer a todos e falo aqui em nome da coordenação e da Comissão Coordenadora. As minhas breves palavras é para vos dar um sumário do que é a rede, o que é que temos feito de agenda no último ano e o que é que nos propomos continuar no futuro muito próximo. Para vos dizer que já foi aqui referido, a nossa agenda é mobilizar a Universidade de Lisboa, toda a sua comunidade, para responder a desafios societais. Temos naturalmente que fazer a ponte entre diferentes áreas do conhecimento e do saber, temos todo um potencial enorme e queremos ultrapassar o que são as escolas fechadas em si, que mesmo que tenham multidisciplinaridade, é necessário fazer a ponte para fora, estimular a colaboração e trabalhar noutro tipo de paradigma. Temos também a questão sobre ligar a universidade e juntar o seu ecossistema no sentido de dar essa resposta aos desafios societais e fazer trabalho que vai desde o fundamental ao aplicado e com impacto. As nossas áreas de atuação, há uma central, a redeSAÚDE, no que toca dentro de mobilizar a Universidade de Lisboa. Estamos também a tentar motivar que a presença da Universidade de Lisboa no EIT Health, do European Institute of Technology, também se desenvolva da melhor forma e temos também liderado o Lisbon Living Plus, um consórcio que reúne a Universidade de Lisboa com outras universidades e instituições da área de Lisboa, para também dar resposta a várias áreas. Não vou entrar em detalhes, em cada universidade as redes estão estruturadas, as redes ou entidades equivalentes de diferente forma, refletindo o nosso ADN. Nós temos 3 áreas transversais relacionadas com a investigação e desenvolvimento, com a inovação e transferência de conhecimento e com os sistemas de saúde e transição digital, e temos 6 grupos, 2 transversais no sentido de medicina de precisão e envelhecimento que cruzam várias áreas e depois 4 grupos de vertente clínica liderados por pessoas da nossa Faculdade de Medicina e que incidem nas áreas de oncologia, doenças neurodegenerativas, infecciosas e doenças de metabolismo e cardiovasculares. Tem a ver com o nosso ADN, com que não podem evoluir, mas que é o nosso ADN. E temos feito, do ano passado para este ano, o ano passado foi um ano em que motivamos workshops e conferências e muitos webinars online, 2021. 2022 foi um ano em que mantivemos a tendência de ter os workshops, os webinars e tivemos a nossa Conferência de Saúde Pública na área do contexto digital no Serviço de Saúde Pública. Isto é parte adicional, mas foi um ano também de mudança, onde tentamos fazer muito mais a ligação com o nosso meio. Por isso, foi o ano em que trouxemos um conjunto de entidades parceiras, empresas, que nos dão algum apoio e onde nós tentamos ter novas iniciativas colaborativas. Por isso, este ano temos trabalhado com a Novartis, com a Plux, com o Hospital da Luz Learning Health, a AstraZeneca e a Gilead, no sentido de ter novas parcerias e também de desenvolver iniciativas que vão ao encontro do que são as necessidades das empresas. Por outro lado, deste ano definimos esta conferência no sentido de, dentro das próprias valências da Lisboa, nós juntarmos áreas. Conceitualmente, o que é que nós juntamos? Grupos dentro da redeSAÚDE para colaborarem. Temos o grupo de inovação com o grupo de sistemas de saúde e transição digital, que é um stream desta conferência. Juntamos a oncologia com a medicina de precisão. Juntamos a investigação com as doenças infectocontagiosas e o envelhecimento, a cardiologia e as doenças neurodegenerativas. Este foi o conceito que deu origem a esta conferência, no sentido de nós próprios juntarmos grupos, colocarmos os grupos a falar e também de estimularmos a investigação nestas diferentes áreas. Por isso, foi o que motivou os 4 streams e os prémios que vamos atribuir hoje. Esta é a parte mais nova da conferência, trazer aqui a nossa comunidade estudantil, mostrar o que melhor é feito nos mestrados e no doutoramento e premiar o mérito no sentido de de reconhecer que trabalhos têm mais impacto, mais potencial. Também para vos dizer que foi um ano interessante no sentido de, no AT Health, temos um conjunto de projetos que estão a decorrer, tanto na área educacional como na área de inovação, sendo um dos projetos que foi ganho e iniciado este ano o Hey for Future, onde, em colaboração com outras redes aqui da Universidade e com outros parceiros, vamos tentar fazer a nossa parte para estimular, da parte educacional, o empreendedorismo e a inovação e fazendo pontos entre as diferentes áreas. A rede naturalmente está em desenvolvimento, propomos a continuar o que temos feito e esperamos que depois deste ano em que fomos buscar as entidades parceiras, as empresas e outras organizações aqui para colaborar com a rede, esperamos também, de alguma forma, motivar muito mais o trabalho com os alunos. Os alunos ainda têm tido uma presença discreta no que é o trabalho da redeSAÚDE, mas planeamos que agora que temos as empresas on board e que vamos estender as empresas, planeamos estender também e envolver, dar empowerment aos alunos para também criarem novas iniciativas. Por último, para vos dizer que há um grande número de pessoas que colaboraram aqui para este evento, temos os chairs, a professora Maria da Amaral, o professor João Eurico, o professor Luís Tato Marinho, a professora Cláudia Lobato da Silva e o professor Mário Gaspar da Silva. Temos a comissão organizadora, eu não vou elencar os nomes, mas temos aqui um grande grupo e não posso deixar de ressalvar o papel da professora Filomena Carnide, que tem sido um motor muito grande de todo o trabalho que está aqui hoje, não só neste evento, mas como no trabalho da rede. Temos aqui o comitê de prémios, que foi liderado pelos professores Mário Silva e António Vaz Carneiro, que também teve aqui algum trabalho de forma muito estruturada, da melhor forma, analisar os trabalhos e agora, hoje, trabalharmos no sentido de premiar os mais relevantes. Não posso deixar de ter palavras para a reitoria, para os serviços da reitoria, para além da equipa reitoral, naturalmente, temos todo o apoio de secretariado, da comunicação e de um conjunto de pessoas muito variado que nos tem dado apoio. E, por último, a reconhecer que este ano foi um ano de mudança e houve alguma diferença com o trabalho das empresas connosco. Aqui eu terminaria só a divulgar que nós tivemos a 15 de outubro um evento sobre o presente e o futuro das terapias celulares, que foi-nos colocado como algo interessante pela Gilead. A 25 de novembro vamos ter um evento sobre workshop sobre terapias génicas, que nos foi proposto pela Novartis, e a ideia é juntarmos saberes aqui da Universidade de Lisboa e discutir o que pode ser feito no futuro, no sentido de lançar sementes para novos projetos e atividades. Última nota, muito do que temos feito de iniciativas tem gerado discussões muito ricas, está tudo disponível no canal YouTube da Lisboa, por isso para os interessados que queiram voltar a ver, por exemplo, o workshop Literacia em Saúde ou o workshop de terapias celulares, nós temos trabalhado no sentido de disponibilizar também materiais que podem ser usados pela comunidade científica académica da melhor forma. Muito obrigada.
Para concluirmos a nossa sessão de abertura, tem a palavra a professora doutora Margarida Amaral, enquanto coordenadora do Eixo de Investigação e Desenvolvimento da redeSAÚDE da Universidade de Lisboa e também em representação dos chairs da 6ª Conferência Anual da redeSAÚDE.
Muito obrigada a todos. Sejam bem-vindos. Gostava de começar por agradecer à Sra. Vice-Reitora e, na sua pessoa, ao Reitor da Universidade de Lisboa. Saliente que a nossa Vice-Reitora nunca deixa de estar presente nas sessões da redeSAÚDE, o que é para nós um especial carinho. Bem sabemos que é a sua área, mas muito agradecemos. À professora Mónica Oliveira, que de facto é a espinha dorsal de tudo o que acontece na redeSAÚDE, não é demais agradecer-lhe todo o seu empenho, entusiasmo, e-mails, mensagens a fora de horas para que as coisas aconteçam atempadamente e corretamente. Hoje é um dia muito especial. Hoje vai nascer o bebé número 8 mil milhões à superfície da Terra. É de facto um facto único, nunca a população a nível mundial atingiu este número, mas também é um enorme desafio. Daí que esta nossa conferência não podia deixar de faltar a palavra global, saúde global, porque de facto temos que pensar hoje em dia um pouco em termos planetários e aquilo que tivemos nos passados anos e ainda continua o resto da pandemia mostrou-nos claramente que não podemos viver isoladamente nem pensar em estratégias isoladas. Daí que tínhamos focado esta 6ª conferência na saúde global, mas, como poderão ver pelos vários workshops que procuramos buscar temas atuais, que vão desde a medicina de precisão em oncologia até a área da saúde digital, temos sempre abordagens multidisciplinares e, de facto, é essa outra palavra que aparece no título desta conferência. Não me vou alongar mais, queria só fazer um comentário que é muito bom ver esta sala tão cheia. Em relação ao ano passado, há um incremento ao qual a diminuição da intensidade da pandemia, obviamente, não é estranha, mas pensamos que é um facto muito positivo, acrescido, obviamente, a todos os que nos seguem diretamente ou posteriormente pelo canal YouTube. Portanto, sem me alongar mais, vamos então dar início, está aberta oficialmente a 6ª conferência, e vamos dar início à primeira sessão de Keynote Speaker. Muito obrigada a todos por estarem aqui conosco.
Dando continuidade ao nosso programa, vamos então dar início à primeira sessão plenária, intitulada From Basic Science to Therapeutic Innovation, Bumpty Road, e pedia o favor de, chamo, aliás, os senhores professores Luís Graça, João Eurico da Fonseca e Beatriz Lima para nos acompanhar nesta primeira sessão, bem como o keynote speaker, professor Michael Goldman. Por favor.
Então, muito bom dia a todos. Cumprimentar, em primeiro lugar, os organizadores, a senhora vice-reitora, a senhora coordenadora da redeSAÚDE e portanto, a senhora professora Mónica Oliveira e Margarida Amaral, responsáveis por este evento. Cumprimentar os meus colegas de painel. And to refer that it is a very high, I think, for all of us, pleasure and honor to introduce you Professor Michelle Goldman, who I'm not being able to see from here. Michelle? Oh, yes, Michelle is there. So, Professor Michelle Goldman is giving us the honor of listening to him to introduce this conference as the keynote speaker. Well, he's a very good friend. He's coming to Portugal, I guess, Michelle, very often. We have met here several times. And Professor Michelle Goldman, he is an immunologist. He is he's a physician, professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And he's, as I said, immunologist, and he is the head and the founder, I'm correct, of the Interdisciplinary Institute, I never, it's 3 E's at the same time, Institute for Interdisciplinary Innovation in Healthcare, which he founded, which is a very interesting institute because it goes in connection to everything that we see being done here, and comes after Michel has been heading the Innovative Medicines Initiative, so the IMI, the so-called IMI 1, which I think is very much in line as an initiative, as you know, and maybe Michel will tell us about that later if you want. That is an initiative which somehow is so multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, putting together all the heads and competencies possible in research, in this case was in health, starting with therapies and progressing into health, where it is now sitting as Innovative Health Initiative. And Michel was really the first chair of this committee, and coming from university. So it was really a great achievement from this academia at one hand, and he had a great job for the promotion of everything that happened and started with IMI. Michel, you will be giving us your lecture on From Basic Science to Therapeutic Innovation, a bumpy road, which is really fitting everything you have been doing, at least since I know you. So thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you to you, Beatrice, and thank you to all the organizers, to Joey. And it's a real pleasure to be here for several reasons, but I must say that it's the first time in my career that I have 3 moderators for my lecture. Probably this illustrates the multidisciplinary nature of the event. But moreover, I can say that these 3 moderators became friends over the years. Beatrice, who was really a key person in the scientific committee at IMI, and Luis, I'm following his wonderful career since, I can almost say, since the very beginning. Joe, we met more recently in the context of the journal Frontiers in Medicine, where Joao is really doing a wonderful job as the editor of the rheumatology section. So, for all these reasons, it's again a real pleasure to be here. So what I will discuss with you, and I will try to emphasize really what's the goal of your conference, which is to foster, to promote multidisciplinarity. And what I will try to do is really to explain why this is so important. And as you will see, to demonstrate the importance of multidisciplinarity, I will very often use examples from the COVID-19 pandemic. But let me start, because we are in a famous university, by making a very strong point. When it comes to therapeutic innovation, new treatment to help patients, we have to remind and to remember that the starting point almost always is in academia. All these new innovative drugs that you see now in the pharmacies, in the hospital, they are there, obviously, they are brought by industry, but the starting point was most often in the academic labs, and this was very well discussed in this paper of Science. There are additional papers showing that, for example, in the US, more than $100 billion were invested by the National Institute of Health, NIH, in research which eventually led to the development of new drugs. And always remember this. We will talk a lot about partnership, multidisciplinarity, and just remember this important point. Now, I guess that when Joao invited me is really to discuss this journey from basic science, from discovery in academic labs to patient treatments. And this is a long and complex journey. Let me go quickly around the different steps. So after the discovery in academic labs, a critical step, and usually this is in academia, and I'm sure that also in this university this is very well organized. It's very important that the discovery is protected by patents, so this is intellectual property protection. And I think that academic researchers, they want freedom, few control, less control as possible. However, they have a duty because they are there because they are funded and their salary comes from the public. And they have a commitment, a duty, when they found something, even by serendipity, is to make sure that it can be useful, it can be brought indeed and become a new drug. And for this, intellectual property, IP protection is essential. Then, and obviously this also starts in the university, you have to organize the technology transfer, which is to transfer the discovery and the technology associated with it to industry. And usually this will start by creating a biotech startup, and again all the universities now in Europe have been very active there. And then very often from the startup it will be brought to a larger industry partner, sometimes a big pharma. And this will allow to continue research, to do clinical trials, and to further continue the development of the drug. Now, I would like to insist that in order to have a drug reaching the patients, a critical step, even when efficacy and safety is proven, is to convince the regulatory agency, and Beatrice did and is still doing a great job in this space of regulatory science. Regulators are there to protect society, to protect citizens, to make sure that the new drugs are efficient but also safe. And that's another, indeed, key step. And then, and I will elaborate this a bit, talking about, multidisciplinarity extended to economics. You need the approval of payers, and you have to make sure that with the pricing of these new drugs, for example, the drug will be available to patients. This question of access to patients is essential. And then it will be very important to continue to look at the efficacy and the safety of the drug once it has been introduced on the market, and this is the so-called post-marketing surveillance and the associated so-called pharmacovigilance. So it's a long, complex journey, and until recently, this took years, very often more than 10 years. And then came the pandemic. And with the pandemic, people sometimes express concern. How is it possible, if this is a long and complex journey, that you got this vaccine in 1 year? And these were the key steps, essentially, during the year 2020. And I think that to explain this, it's very important, again, coming back to basic research, that first, the basic research was there for years, and I will come back to that in a moment. And in 1 year, what was done is to make sure that all the key steps, establish efficacy, but also safety, I will come back to this, were just as stringent as with previous vaccine, and this has been the case. So everyone made a special effort. But again, when people express concern, how is it possible to have a completely new drug in 1 year? This is not the case. As you can see here, this has been recently reviewed. It's really since 20 years that mRNA products have been tested in humans, so we learn a lot. I will not go through the different steps. The key message here, these vaccines are not really new technology. This technology was known and, as I said, was tested in humans for almost 20 years. And this is why it was possible indeed to use this and to develop this new vaccine. Now, this is an event about multidisciplinarity. So look at, these vaccines. They are composed of mRNA, that you can see. And as you see here, I will try to, you know, this mRNA is packaged in lipid nanoparticles which have a key role. And actually when we discuss, you know, the development of those vaccines, mRNA is very important, and it was necessary to modify the mRNA to make it more efficient and less inflammatory. I will not go into detail. But another key aspect was the development of these nanoparticles which protect the mRNA, enhance the translation of the mRNA into protein, and also provide what is key for vaccine, the so-called adjuvant activity. Now, all this was possible because of the collaboration of a number of scientists from different disciplines. Obviously, you know, it's a vaccine against a viral disease. You need virologists. And I would like to mention here the Chinese virologist, the Chinese researcher. Immediately after they identified the genome of the virus, they made it public. And that's why already in early January 2020, you know, the labs which had the technology could start to prepare the vaccine candidate because they knew the genome sequence of the virus. Then obviously you need molecular biologists, you need chemists. Remember the lipid nanoparticles, chemists were essential there. You need pharmacists, I mean this is a pharmaceutical product. You need immunologists to make sure that this vaccine will induce the response that you would like by the immune system. Obviously, you need industry partners to make sure that once you have a good candidate, it can be produced in large amount and distributed. You need, obviously, clinical investigators, and I just heard, and I think that in these universities with Joao and others, clinical investigation is important. And indeed, it was essential to prove the efficacy and safety of the vaccine. You need biostatisticians. That's very important, also to make epidemiological model. And I already mentioned, you need regulators, scientific regulators who really understand that they have to take the right decision with the best timing possible without compromise on the safety, of course. And indeed, it's really essential that we think again about how we organize the education, the training of all those professionals who, for a reason or another, will indeed be involved in health system. And this was well demonstrated in this paper by the Institute of Medicine in the US, and I will not read the slide, it speaks by itself, but I think it's really important, and it's a question of really revisiting our traditional way to educate. We have to break the silos and to really make people working much more together. Now, this interdisciplinarity, this convergence of disciplines for health, because this is actually what we are talking about, is necessary. We also need to provide those new programs with sufficient money, sufficient funds. And we have to organize, as I already said, and I will come back to this, the partnership with industry. Well, this was critical for the pandemic, but it's also critical for other major challenges in health. And I would like to mention here antimicrobial resistance. I think that this is the next challenge which represents the next major threat for our populations, especially in Europe. Would also like to mention dementia. This is really a challenge because, you know, it has huge impact on our societies, but it's also probably one of the most difficult scientific challenges. And that's the reason why we have all those failures. I just heard that yesterday Roche announced that the phase 3 trial they had with a new antibody failed. So it's really difficult, it's risky, it mobilizes a lot of money, and success is not always there. And I will discuss a bit later about rare diseases, which are very often neglected. Now, let's continue with the lessons from COVID. So, you can develop fast, you can bring people from different disciplines working together, and when you succeed to do so, I mean, the success is indeed there, and the success can be easily measured, well, not so easily actually, but there are several papers, I just make the choice of one here, showing that we are talking about millions of lives which all over the world were saved by this vaccine. And in this paper from The Economist, and it was also in the Lancet, it is estimated that 20 million of lives were saved, directly or indirectly. We can obviously argue about those numbers, but they are huge. Now, and I will come back to this. You know, this has been a tremendous success in rich, developed countries, but we can question about what has been done for poor and low middle-income countries. Now, this success was made possible, I already alluded to this, because both efficacy and safety were demonstrated efficiently and rapidly. And there are a number of papers, and remember that in terms of efficacy, and this was a surprise, the efficacy was remarkable, around 90% for all these vaccines of reduction in infection, which infection means risk of viral transmission. This was at the very beginning, and obviously remarkable efficacy in terms of preventing severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And safety was also rapidly and efficiently demonstrated. Since the very beginning, it was clear that you can have some so-called reactogenic reaction, pain at the site of injection. You can have some fever, some malaise, but usually in 2 or 3 days, this is over. Since the early months post-vaccination, it was still clear that there could be some very rare, exceptional adverse events, and important, such as anaphylaxis, such as thrombopenia for the adenoviral vector vaccines, and myocarditis, pericarditis for mRNA vaccine. And this was quite rapidly recognized, but their incidence was slow. And that's the reason why those vaccines could be developed so rapidly and were, by and large, well accepted by our population. Now, I think that now is the time, and reflect on this. You know, and I know that in these countries the same. I mean, the acute phase of the pandemic is obviously over. We have still circulation of viral variants, but by and large, COVID-19 is no more on the top of the health agenda. And we are all able to live again a normal life. But now is the time to reflect. Where are we today? And let's talk first about efficacy. And I think that it's important to be transparent about those questions. Efficacy is still remarkable, and we should emphasize that indeed protection against severe disease, hospitalization, and death is still there, even with the new variants, Delta and now Omicron, and we can be optimistic that this will continue. However, the efficacy in terms of preventing the infection and viral transmission is much weaker. And you all know this because the virus was still circulating quite intensively some months ago without dramatic consequences because people were protected against severe disease by vaccination. But the infection itself and transmission is really not well prevented. Now, there are several reasons for this. First is that variants developed and variants tend to escape the immune response elicited by the vaccine. The second reason is that it appears that the immunity induced by those vaccines is waning quite rapidly. And that's the reason why, as you know, we need boosters. This was not so obvious at the very beginning. The hope was indeed to prevent efficiently transmission and to reach herd immunity and so on. So this is something that we should acknowledge, and that's the reason why it's so important to continue research. We are not done with this vaccine. We should do and we must do better in terms of efficacy. Now, what about safety? Safety, again, by and large, the vast majority of people have tolerated very well the vaccine. However, it is my opinion that now is the time to acknowledge that in very rare cases, we are talking about 1 to 10 per million of doses administered, you can have some severe adverse reactions. I already mentioned the first three. There are two others which are recognized by regulatory agencies as linked to vaccination in, again, rare individuals, but they are there. You see Guillain-Barré syndrome and the capillary leak syndrome, which is a disease which can kill people. It's very rare. I think in Belgium we lost one patient, but still it's there and the link is established. Now, why is it so important to continue to do research, not only to have more efficient, but perhaps also safer vaccine? Because some of the adverse events that I just mentioned, they are rare, but in the context of the pandemic, it's not, I mean, it was a problem for patients or citizens suffering from them, but I mean, we saved millions of lives, and you know, this was in a way, there was no choice than to really use those vaccines as massively as possible. And by the way, those side effects are not very different, even the adverse events, from what we observed with previously approved vaccines. Why is it important to continue? Because now the acute phase of the pandemic is over, and now, you know, people are thinking that mRNA vaccines are the solution for other infectious disease, respiratory syncytial virus, cytomegalovirus, Ebola, and others. And as you know, people are also, again, considering mRNA vaccine for cancer, and this is a selected list of vaccines which are currently in investigation. So for some of those indications, adverse events, even rare, should be recognized, and possibly if you could identify the patient at risk, this would be important. And that's the reason why, and I will not discuss this today, but myself, I'm quite deeply involved also in looking at other type of putative side effects linked to the unique ability of those cells to stimulate a particular population of lymphocytes, those cells which defend ourselves, and but those cells can also cause, in some cases, disease, especially autoimmune disease, and I know that in this university autoimmune disease are studied. So it's very important, and there are indications that in some patients indeed those vaccines might have might induce, for example, flares of autoimmune disease. This is not recognized yet, but it must be studied. Now, the other important lesson from COVID is that disease in general are multifactorial. Obviously, you have a virus, but the virus will not cause the same disease. The disease will not be expressed the same way in every person. And this is known very well. We heard about the increased susceptibility of older individuals, of obese persons, and we know about the comorbidities, which will also influence the outcome of COVID-19. But let's explain that those different disease expression which are seen with COVID are also seen, I would say, for almost each disease. And just to explaining in a simple manner, and it also explains why multidisciplinarity is so important. You have an influence of our genome, and I will illustrate this in a moment about COVID. We have an important influence of our environment, the so-called exposome, which include the environment. Pollution is one element which might influence, obviously, disease expression. The climate, and I will make a comment about this, or diet. And also you have the influence of the microbiome, those bacteria that we have in our body, in our gut. They were supposed to be innocent bystanders, but they have an influence of the expression of disease. And just a few examples from COVID. You see that there is already at least one paper or other papers showing that the composition of our gut microbiome has an influence on the severity of COVID-19. And what has been shown for COVID has been shown for other disease, including diabetes, including non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, just to give you two examples. And it also supposed to have an influence on some brain disorders. So I talk about the genome, and it's important to understand that the expression of our genes depends on so-called epigenetics. Those are mechanisms which govern the expression of those genes. And again, the exposome, the environment, might have a very important influence of this epigenome. And this has been again demonstrated for COVID-19. Now, environment. This is a study which has been done in Italy, in the region where, you know, everything started acutely, and you see that indeed there the influence of air pollution was well established. Now we are talking a lot about climate those days, and I will not discuss about COVID, but in general, it's clear that this climate change has an influence on a number of diseases through a number of mechanisms. I have no time to discuss them all. Just I will insist on vector-mediated diseases such as dengue, such as Zika, where mosquitoes have such an important, and clearly with the climate change, we see more of those diseases in countries which in the past were more or less devoid of this disease. Now, what about the genome? And again, we come back to collaboration and come back to multidisciplinary. This is a study which was led, I think that if you look at the list of the COVID human genetic efforts, there are more than 100 investigators which were co-authors of this paper. It was necessary really to make these large collaborative studies to identify the few individuals, especially young individuals, which normally do not develop severe COVID, to understand why very few individuals which should be protected actually still develop severe disease. And it's because of this work that it was possible to identify some genes, and I will not go into details, but those are genes involved in the so-called type 1 interferon pathway. This is a very important pathway in the immune system upon infection. And so when you don't produce sufficient type 1 interferon, or if this type 1 interferon cannot work, then you can develop a severe disease even if you don't have other risk factors. And I would like to emphasize here, it's a lesson from COVID, but we knew from previous studies that to study rare patients, rare disease can be extremely useful, productive in drug development. These are just examples looking at some gene variants, rare individuals, which allow to develop drugs. And obviously, one of the first examples, I know it very well because it was in my university in Brussels, the identification of few patients with a mutation in the CCR5 gene, which is a receptor for the HIV virus, was key, and eventually to the development of Maraviroc, which is a drug which is still used in some patients, which block this CCR5. There are other examples. You know that now for hypercholesterolemia, we use these anti-PCSK9 products, which were developed because a few individuals with mutation of the gene coding for PCSK9 demonstrate the influence of this enzyme in the metabolism of cholesterol. And there are other examples. I will not elaborate more. They are also listed on this slide. And you see that on the left part that, the study of relatively rare disease eventually led to treatments for more frequent disease. And that's a very important lesson. Do not neglect rare disease. And before this talk, we were discussing about the importance of human investigations. And you know that until recently, animal models were supposed to be the secret to develop new drugs. Now you can really use rare human patients to test relevant hypotheses. Now, talking about this, obviously, rare disease, you have this revolution of gene therapies. You see that there has been a real explosion of the number of rare genetically based therapies that can be treated and eventually completely cured by a single gene therapy. Now, as we will see later, this is all wonderful, but the question is still, will all those patients with this rare disease have access to this new gene therapy treatment? Now, the other lesson from COVID, and again, it demonstrates that we need people with skills in artificial intelligence, in digital tools. Indeed, during COVID, digital tools and artificial intelligence became extremely important. Obviously, for several reasons. I will come back to digital tools and telemedicine in a moment, but you have to know that one of the drugs which is approved for severe COVID-19, baricitinib, is a drug which has been discovered by artificial intelligence. What has been done there is to screen banks, or actually big data banks, to identify products which might indeed interfere with the virus life, and this is how baricitinib was identified. Now, obviously, there are other applications of digital tools, and you all know that telemedicine has been extremely useful during the pandemic. And also, this movement was already there, but I don't know how many people in this room have a smartwatch, but there are more and more connected devices which allow you to monitor your health and to communicate your observation to your doctors. And during COVID, this developed quite well. Remember that, some people during the pandemic, because they were afraid to have respiratory involvement, they used these easy tools to monitor oxygen levels in the blood, the oximeters. This is another example of the fact that actually the patient, him or herself, can, in a way, play a role which previously was the role of the doctor, just looking at your own health. Now, and this creates a famous challenge for doctors and for universities. For doctors, because, very often the patient is coming with his or her diagnosis, and or supposed diagnosis. And for the doctors it's just impossible to have in mind all the publication, all the new created knowledge. So doctors also use, digital information and use access to database to make the right diagnosis. Then the question becomes, what's the role of the doctor? And I think that's extremely important, and we should not lose this important role of the doctor, in translating digital tools and related tools in the clinical care. The role of the doctor is really to explain to the patients the results of all the examination, all the information coming from different sources, including the patient, him or herself, and together with the patient to make the right choice of the right treatment for these particular patients, because what AI will probably never be able to do is to take into account all the individual characteristics of the patient, including his preferences. You can have a given disease with given characteristic, and there might be different options, and for different reasons, you might have preference for one therapeutic option versus another. Now, and that's very important when we talk about lessons from COVID-19, is that solidarity is key. This is not a new lesson about infectious disease. This is a quote from a Nobel laureate from the Pasteur Institute in the beginning of the 20th century. And he said, okay, we are all on the same boat because we are all exposed to the same virus, and we can transmit the virus from one person to the other. So we have to work together to address this. And if something didn't go very well during the pandemic, is that indeed those wonderful collaborative approaches, still they were not, all countries over the world did not get the same benefit. I will not elaborate on this. This is well known, but this is still a problem. Still, through different initiatives, including the so-called COVAX program, vaccination coverage improved in poor countries, but still about 40 to 50% of people in those countries didn't get a COVID vaccine. And the Director General of WHO clearly summarized this by reminding everyone that no one is safe from COVID until everyone is safe, and we are far from having developed the strategies to indeed have this statement put in practice. And that's why, and I think that one of you sort of discussed the importance of involving economics in the conversation. Actually, this is what I do in this I3H Institute, that I launched is really to consider those questions very early on. And well, this is something which was not frequent in the past, and I think that it's developing more and more, and it's becoming more and more important. So solidarity and economic aspects are important for pandemic, for COVID, but also coming back to rare disease, look in this table that we produced recently. You have to look at the first column at the price of currently approved gene therapies. Those are prices somewhere between 600 million, let's say, euros, and as you can see here, it can go up to 5 times this already tremendously high price. So how can we afford this? How can societies afford this? Is it justified? Those are important questions that we have to analyze in a transparent manner, and obviously for this we need the collaboration of industry, and I think this is one of the challenges for the future. One of the solutions of the approach that we proposed together with our economist colleague was for some very innovative therapies, very costly, to create subsidiaries of companies with a benefit corporation status. So this benefit corporation status imposed to industry, which can remain for profit, that's not the issue. Industry are private, they should make profit, but within some boundaries. And with benefit corporation, you introduce the duty of those subsidiaries to take into consideration, for example, in their performance indicators, more than just the return of investment, not just what the shareholders are expecting from the companies. Now, to conclude this lecture, I would like to emphasize a key point also derived from the COVID-19 pandemic, which is health literacy. You know that the myths or disinformation that circulated during the pandemic, this was just unbelievable on social networks everywhere. So, I mean, this will continue, but we have to make sure that everyone, every citizen, receive enough education to really be able to interpret this information the right way, and really to make a distinction between what is true, what is probably true, and what is completely false. And that's very important. And this fact that you know more about your health, it's also important to develop, these new medicine based on new tools that you have on yourself. But it's also important, indeed, to understand what's ongoing and the public health decision. And if you are interested by those questions, I suggest that you have a look at this book, which was written by actually psychologists from the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and they argue that indeed we need different education programs, obviously for healthcare professionals to get better doctors, but also for citizens and patients. And this health literacy is something that you will acquire very early in life. And myself, I spend, a significant part of my time nowadays to discuss in primary schools with, young children. They can be 11 or 12-year-olds, and I try to explain them about these microbial bugs and superbugs and why vaccination is so important. And I really think that it's really early on that this health literacy can be acquired and developed. And if you are interested by the topic, just read the very last issue of The Lancet, and I will just read this sentence to conclude my talk. Science is important, but education is the vector that transmits to every new generation curiosity, passion, and commitment to reimagine the future, extend the limits of human possibility, and achieve a more just social world. And on this, I thank you very much for your attention. And since we have 3 moderators, I'm sure that I will get questions.
No, I think I have some now. We are already fighting and disputing the microphone among the 3 of us. So thank you very much for this very comprehensive and mind-opening talk on the subject of health and multidisciplinary approach to health. So I start by asking if we have questions from the audience. Yes, we have one question over there. Do we have a microphone for? You can shout, but
while we wait for this question, can I ask you, from the very beginning, your point from the basic science to more applied research, something that I would like you to comment on is the directed basic research towards a problem, because the example that you gave, the development were already with an objective, but several developments that came to be of major importance, like CRISPR-Cas9 or even monoclonal antibodies, were discoveries that were made not with the objective of dealing with a problem.
Well, you are completely right, and actually, you know, I didn't have time to elaborate on this. I think that it's really important that basic research scientists can remain as free as possible to make the choice of their topics, because you never know which is the major discovery which will find application. You are completely right, but the point I was trying to make is that even if you are completely free to make your own choice, if you discover something, you still have to think about your societal commitment. But you are completely right. Also, you can argue that even mRNA vaccine, you had, you know, this very early basic research on mRNA, which was performed before anyone imagined that mRNA would be used in pharmaceutical products.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, very insightful. My question is, which strategies do you use to improve the communication between scientists and economists? You mentioned that in your institute, it's your role, or you work on that.
Yeah, I can tell you it's a challenge, and what I learned over these years, you know, and economics are, I mean, there are journals of health economics. They launch, you know, a number of studies, and the most recent that I heard was about, you know, looking at the influence of, you know, being involved in social networks on C-section in pregnant women. I mean, sometimes they raise, you know, questions that you don't imagine as a professional. I think that the challenge there is really to bring economists and people who know the disease and the treatments together. Right now, I would say that it's still disconnected. Even in my institute, I sometimes, you know, fights with the economists saying, okay, but what are you doing there? This is not how the disease is expressed. This is not how treatments are organized. So I think there is still a long way to go, but I think that the only way is really to bring people together, and sometimes it will be around the coffee machine that you will really foster this collaboration, and that there is a mindset to be changed. And Beatrice, you mentioned that mindset change between, you know, academics and people industry. I still that regarding bringing together economics people and academic and biologists, for example, or doctors, there is still a long way to go. Yeah,
thank you. I agree. You need a shift in the mindset to have better innovations. Thank you.
Other questions? While you think on other questions, my comment and my attention was a little bit drained for a part of your presentation that discussed the interplay between what we have in our minds in terms of our personal views of an health problem and what the social media, the TV, the journals, etc., will implement in the minds of the society. And this was clearly an issue in the early days of the pandemic and over the story of the pandemic. But in the early days, there was also a problem with doctors, because also doctors were involved in this misinformation, because the lack of information made doctors believe not in science, but in something else, okay? And that is a very interesting aspect, because it was not only those that were not adequately informed about medicine, but also those that were adequately informed about medicine. And this is linked with the way the development of science and the development of medicine should interact in a new world where communication has deviated our minds and has created new challenges. And so, although you haven't discussed this specifically, but how do you view the current perspective of having a reality that is linked to the evidence of science, the evidence of medicine, of new medication, and then the way the information goes between people in a very fast way, and things that are not true become true in the mind of everybody, including physicians, in a sense.
Well, I think this is a very important comment, and what you said about the media is also true about politicians. And I think that's important. And I must say that during the pandemic, you know, and this is especially about, you know, some of the safety issues. I remember where the first thrombotic events developed. You know, everyone was saying, why, you know, that's not a problem to have young women with thrombotic event. This is frequent. You have the contraceptive pills. And it's because a few clever physicians made the relation with heparin-induced thrombocytopenia that at the end. So I think that, yeah, first we must be careful in what we are saying. And this is true indeed also for physicians. And the second aspect is transparency and recognition of the unknowns. That's very important, to recognize uncertainty and what we don't know. And that's not always easy for us when you have a journalist in front of you. Sorry, I don't know, I cannot answer your question. But that's sometimes the best answer you can give. Now, the other difficult aspect is transparency. And I try to allude to this by saying that nowadays, at least it's my view, we should acknowledge that those vaccines are not perfect. They do the most important job, but they are not perfect. And we should recognize it, because otherwise you have people who just use the weaker points to criticize the whole system. And the same is for safety. You know, and you know, everyone will say these vaccines are perfectly safe. But no, also in the population, people know that the virus is still there about efficacy, and people know that there are some side effects that, you know, can be sometimes serious. And for example, yesterday I was discussing with hemato-oncologists here at the Champalimau Foundation about, you know, what you do with lymphadenopathies when they developed in patients receiving vaccine. This is very frequent. And I'm sure that several of you in your environment, you have people who develop some, you know, bizarre things. And I think that what is known, we should acknowledge it and not just hide it. And that's, I think, one important aspect. And I agree with you that our colleagues are not always perfect in doing this job. Thank you.
But I wanted you to expand a bit more, and that is related with data science and the role of data scientists, all the ethics issues around it. So I would like to know what is your opinion about this data science in general and open science, the role that perhaps also patients may play in there, or humans in general may play in there.
So thank you for your question. Actually, I will add a slide the next time I give this presentation. No, I think you are fully right. Data science, and that's also a lesson of the COVID. Just think about epidemiology. You know, until the pandemic, you know, I look at epidemiology, oh, it's interesting, but will it change anything to clinical practice? And the answer is yes. So you need epidemiological models. You need to go quickly to get data from clinical trials quickly. You need data from the patients, especially, you know, in the post-marketing phase. You have to collect those data, to analyze those data. This is key. You are fully right. And obviously, the question is privacy. How far can you go? And this is, I think it's a very important question. And that's why I think that it's important also when we talk about health literacy to put, you know, health in the vision of the common good, and that people start to understand that indeed to provide their data is not to make, you know, shareholders of a company more rich, but it's also to help society at large. It's a delicate balance, but I think that to make further progress, there is no choice, in my opinion. We have to find solutions to take advantage and to exploit data science as efficiently as possible.
Clearly. Thank you, Michel, so much for this great morning, great start. Just before finalizing, because we are getting to time, I just leave a challenge. Maybe it's not for discussing here, but maybe we could think about this, which is actually we talk about, and we talk a lot about lessons learned from COVID. And when we talk about lessons learned from COVID, then we get the mRNA vaccine as a big innovation somehow, which, by the way, it could have been, especially the way it has been developed, in my view, fast. Somehow, you need to remember Ebola. mRNA started being used in Ebola vaccines. So somehow, the path was there, the point of cares, the early diagnosis, there was a full methodology that was in place when COVID came, and then it was just jumping. So my question to you, and then it's the point that mRNA had never been administered directly to anybody. So to push the machinery internally, it was coming ex vivo, as you were saying, but not internally. So somehow the challenge was really to make that path. And my question is, what is really the biggest achievement? Is it the mRNA vaccine itself, or has it been the mindset and the methodology that has been put together to be able to put this vaccine into full access in such a short period? Because somehow, and is it just the vaccine, or should it be somehow in the future for our lessons to learn applied to medicines also? Because we were not so successful with medicines, maybe because many challenges were there still in place for medicines, not applied the same way as the vaccine.
Well, you know, that's an important question. I would say that, and I try to make the point, there are different key discoveries, but probably what has been remarkable is really to get all these people from different horizons working together, and you know, this is indeed what IMI tried to promote at some point. But I must say that, you know, that's us as human beings. The driver has been the pandemics. When you see all those people dying, when you see the pressure on society, you see, you know, all these people having to stay at home, and so you have to do something. And then you start to be able to do things that you would never imagine because you are pushed by the situation. And that's why I think it's important to draw the lessons, because there will not always be such a pressure. But still, some of the lessons we should try to implement what we learned in situations which are less dramatic but still important.
So the strategy somehow.
Yeah.
I might close. So thank you again very much for this very, very interesting session, and also thank you all for participating and interacting with the speaker.
Thank you.
So coffee break time.
Oh.